Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's program by discussing the Taliban and the situation in Afghanistan and as a whole. Now, just a while back, we had the Americans accuse the Russians of paying bounties to the Taliban and other extremist groups in that country to kill U.S. soldiers. Now, there's such an accusation placed against Iran as well, saying that the Iranians have also paid bounties to different groups to kill American soldiers as well. This is, of course, all coming from the U.S. intelligence. Is all of the above true? Why would the Russians and the Iranians want to hurt the peace deal if that is really what the goal here was? Now, the Americans say they did not retaliate against these Iranian bounties that were paid to kill U.S. soldiers, specifically talking about a Bagram attack as well, because they wanted to prioritize the peace deal going through. But then this also raises many, many questions, which I then want to put to my panelists who are joining us now. Joining us from Ottawa this morning is Irfan, who is a Master's in International Affairs student at Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. His research focuses on security issues, including terrorism and the Taliban. Joining us from Akron in Ohio is Karl, who is a professor and director of security studies at the University of Akron. Karl and Irfan, thank you both for your time this morning. Irfan, let me start with you. Let's start with these accusations against the Iranians and the Russians. Do you believe them? Do you think that the Iranians and Russians would want to pay anybody to kill American soldiers?
Well, the allegation that Russia is secretly offering bounties on the life of American soldier can be a highly sensitive issue, and I think we should be very careful in approaching it. I think what is very important in this analysis, first, what is the source of this piece of information? Second, what's Moscow rationale behind orchestrating such a fearless move? And third, what's the current relation between the two states? And I'm telling you this issue is significantly hyperbolic because, first of all, there is no solid evidence that actually can hold Russia responsible for incentivizing the Taliban to kill Americans and coalition forces, even though the data of the report is held in high secret. According to the New York Times, the intelligence of this report is based on the interrogation of some Afghan militant and the Taliban members. Now, for a moment, let's dig deep into this issue. Most of the militant fighting in the coalition are foot soldiers, and virtually all of them hardly have any awareness of the realpolitik. The only thing that they know is to wage jihad in the cause of Allah and some other nationalistic factor. So even though if the Russian has link between the two groups, it would be with the high-ranking Taliban members, not the infantry. There, it would be a naive conclusion to rely on the lowest-ranking Taliban member for this high politics.
The Iranian role, do you believe that the Iranians would want to kill Americans through any of these groups in Afghanistan?
Well, in general, they have been contacted the Taliban, not for specific targeting Americans, but in general, yes, they do have cooperation with the Taliban members, and there are strong evidences for that. Even the Russian had link with the Taliban, but the context was totally different. For example, just a few years ago, Russian was trying to, repel Islamic State of Khorasan members who are mainly based in Afghanistan northern province, who has border with the Central Asian state, and because of that reason, Russian tried to give some money to the Taliban members and some small amount of arms.
Okay.
That's true.
Karl, what are your thoughts on this? It seems that if we're to believe these reports of the face of it, that the Iranians and Russians have almost made a pact of some sort to pay to have American soldiers killed in Afghanistan to hurt the peace deal. Why would they want to do that?
Well, for one, I think people tend to get stuck a bit on the issue of paid bounties. And I think when I look at this, the bigger issue is just aid in general from the Russian government and from the Iranian government to the Taliban. And that's fairly well established, that there have been weapons flows, other kinds of aid given to the Taliban by the Iranians and the Russians through their security apparatus into Afghanistan. They clearly have an incentive to aid the Taliban. They want the United States out as quickly as possible. They also want the United States to incur a bloody nose because they want the United States to be less willing and less confident about going into other parts of the world that they consider their very important strategic regions. You know, the Russians don't want the United States to be surrounding Russia, nor do the Iranians. So a bloody nose for the United States and Afghanistan is definitely in the interests of these two countries. Whether they're actually paying specific bounties or not, I think is less consequential than the fact that they're actively engaging in giving the Taliban weapons that can be used to kill U.S. soldiers.
I'm wondering, Karl, if I may just, hone in on Iran for a moment. Iran hosts significant numbers of Afghan refugees as well and has done so over these many years. Wouldn't it be in its interest to actually have this peace deal, to actually have proper peace come to Afghanistan? I mean, it sort of seems like they would be beating their own heads with a hammer if they were to go against the deal, wouldn't they? Well,
that's a good point. Now, this aid is not new. This has been going on for years. So the question is, would the Russians or would the Iranians, we're speaking more specifically about the Iranians right now, would they be incentivized to stop aiding the Taliban? And I think the answer to that is their incentive is to continue to help the Taliban. One of the reasons, as I stated before, is to get the United States to leave as soon as possible. The more the United States incurs casualties, the more likely it is that the United States is going to leave the country. That's the thinking, at least. And the other thing is both the Russians and the Iranians want a good relationship with the Taliban after the Taliban potentially wins back Afghanistan. Yeah. And if you look at the trajectory of the Taliban right now, they seem to be doing fairly well. So this is kind of an insurance policy for the Iranians and the Russians.
Irfan, what are your thoughts on, the strength of the Taliban, right? We've had the Americans in Afghanistan for many years now, if we're completely honest, but it doesn't seem to have weakened the Taliban enough for them to be completely defeated. Does this mean that the U.S. is also in some ways accepting the Taliban and that regional countries such as Iran and Russia also then need to learn to live with the Taliban in power?
Yeah, absolutely. U.S. has spent billions of dollars, shed its soldier blood to bring stability into Afghanistan, but to no avail. And recently, the United States has realized that whether the Taliban, who are an integral part of the Afghanistan society, they are trying to bring them back to the Afghan government. And even though the current situation between the Taliban and Afghanistan government is very turbulent, the United States go ahead and try to establish good relationship with the Taliban. And Iran also has realized that they would have good relationship with the Taliban and don't want to go back to Sunni Shia conflicts that used to be during the Taliban regime with the Taliban government in between Iran.
Yeah. Good point. We'll have that as our final point, but we appreciate both Irfan and Karl for their time today and for their expertise on this, because, when we're talking about specifically what's happening in Afghanistan and other external players, apart from the United States and their involvement in the country, it seems to become muddier waters, at least if we're to completely believe U.S. intelligence reports. Now, yes, there is no doubt that the Russians and the Iranians probably do have some sort of contacts with the Taliban there in Afghanistan, because what other choice do they have? They're looking at the track record, right? They're seeing that the Taliban are still very much powerful and strong in the country and still are able to wield enough influence to be able to hurt U.S. interests and to be able to hurt the Kabul government. So then they want to make nice with those who are probably going to be in power in the future in some way or another, be it as a coalition with other groups or even themselves alone. And that's the fact that even the Americans have now accepted. That is why the Americans, at the end of the day, came to this deal directly with the Taliban. So why is this that big a deal? And can we specifically believe this issue of bounties paid? As Karl there said, and Irfan, in fact, we haven't seen necessarily the kind of smoking gun evidence on the part of the Americans to prove that, yes, the Iranians and Russians are paying bounties to have their soldiers killed. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the UN-backed tribunal into Rafik Hariri's assassination about 15 years or so ago. That assassination occurred. Ever since then, there was a tribunal set up in The Hague in the Netherlands. And now that tribunal has found one member of Hezbollah guilty of the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri. Nevertheless, it has exonerated Hezbollah leadership, saying there was no connection to the leadership itself of the organization in that assassination. What does this mean within the context of what is currently going on within Lebanon? Because we have the long-standing protests against the system of governance, corruption, mismanagement in the country. That's been happening for a significant amount of time now. And then we've also just recently had the Beirut port explosion as well. And that in and of itself has created its own political ramifications for the ruling elite in that country, including, of course, Hezbollah, which is very much part of the political landscape in that country. Let's discuss all of that a bit further with our guests who are joining us now. Joining us from Beirut are Dr. Naim Salem, who is a professor of international affairs and diplomacy at Notre Dame University. Also joining us from the Lebanese capital is Dr. Hadi Wahab, who is a researcher and postgraduate teacher assistant at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. And joining us from Dubai is Arthur Blok, who is executive editor-in-chief of the Levant News, which is a regional news platform with correspondents all over the Middle East and GCC region. Arthur, Naim, and Hadi, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Naim, let me start with you. What do you make of the tribunal's decision and its impact on Lebanon?
Let's start from the impact. The decision did not have, and it will not have much impact on Lebanon. It really, many people expected that once the decision is taken and declared from The Hague, the situation will aggravate in Beirut, or confrontation will ensue, etc. That did not happen. One reason is that the whole 4 hours, and I have watched the tribunal deliberation a couple of days ago from noon our time till 5 p.m. It was so indecisive. They're talking and talking and talking. They're getting into too much technicalities without focusing on the real issues. And the entire decision of this tribunal was based, ironically, on the communication, on circumstantial evidence. And this does not hold in any court of law, in any serious court of law internationally, only on circumstantial evidence related to mobile connection and mobile phones. And we know technically that there are many countries around the world and many sides or groups around the world that can play with mobile communication and get one communication setting into another. So this really, many people in Lebanon, and the absolute majority, I might say, were surprised by the lack of evidence presented in this tribunal to reach a proper decision to tell us who killed Mr. Rafik Hariri. Okay. There was a great deal of disappointment out of this decision taken by the tribunal after 12 years following the setting up of this tribunal and a cost of $500 million on Lebanon. It was a disaster as far as the results of which this tribunal has produced. Nothing of value. Of value, and it is not based. And
that's a very, very good point that you made there, Naim. I wanted to get Arthur's point of view on that as well, because Arthur, what Naim has just outlined is in fact the sort of reaction I've seen in some quarters in Lebanon. Of course, not all. That there has been just a huge waste of money. I mean, $1 billion, I believe, is the cost of this entire tribunal and this investigation, quote unquote. But we've relied completely, as Naim there said, on mobile phone data. Do you believe that there was a smoking gun here? Do you believe that Hezbollah's leadership was involved? What kind of an impact then does this have for the country?
I'm following this tribunal from the beginning. I'm half Dutch myself, so I've been there when they opened the tribunal with a lot of fanfare. And I totally agree with Naim. It was an embarrassing moment when the indictment was, read out to the public, when the verdict was mentioned. Indecisiveness, painful for Lebanon, a lot of money spent. But, if you know a little bit how the Hezbollah organization works, and I don't think it's possible that one member did it all by himself. I mean, there's a clear indication that even though the evidence was, let's say, not conclusive, it was all based and could easily be falsified. The whole idea, what happened was as follows. I was in Beirut at the time of the explosion. After the explosion, you could just drive around Beirut. Well, at that time, the Syrian army was in charge of it. So you could not really believe what happened. There was an enormous explosion, and you could just drive around Beirut. Not one checkpoint, not one car being stopped, as if it was all expected. So now we have, let's say, we are now, 15 years further on the road. Now we have a Hezbollah member being named as being guilty. Now I think Hezbollah is at stake and can say, listen, we're going to sacrifice the individual and let him come forward and, let him be punished. Because in the end, we need somebody to have some kind of punishment for this.
Hadi, what are your thoughts on this? Because, this adds, does it not, to the complication of what's happening on the ground right now vis-a-vis the political crisis and, all these people demanding that the governance system be changed, of which Hezbollah is also very much a part?
I would agree with what they said, but the main problem is that, Waqar, we have 2 weeks ago, more than 200 people are died, and you have more than 6,000 injured, and you have more than 300,000 displaced. Half of Beirut is destroyed. If you go on the ground and see what happened, half of it is destroyed. The situation is catastrophic. So after 15 years, and at this moment, having such an outcome after what we've paid from our money, I guess they should pay the money back. We paid $1 billion for nothing. And if you accuse a member of Hezbollah, it means you're accusing the whole party. It's not like he took that decision and went to do such a thing. But even if you accuse it and they were able to prove it by the STL, nothing would change because nothing can be done towards Hezbollah in such a situation. It's not like the international community is going to come and put Hezbollah on trial. The Lebanese are more concerned with the long-term corruption and clientelism that has been engulfing Lebanon. So this is the main problem, and without making a change on that level, nothing will alter on the ground.
Okay, Naim, we're completely honest, even within these protests that we're seeing right now in Lebanon, there's a lot of anti-Hezbollah discussion as well. At least that's what we're seeing outside the country, right, from the outside in. What are your thoughts about that? Can Hezbollah just be wished away? I mean, it is an important part of Lebanese politics, and there are a lot of supporters.
Well, Hezbollah is a very well-organized entity. Probably currently in the international system, it is the most efficient and most organized military entity outside armies and outside state structures. And the outcome of the tribunal does not affect Hezbollah. By naming this one individual of Hezbollah, based on this, what I call it circumstantial, absolutely circumstantial evidence, does not show or does not prove that Hezbollah was behind this assassination. It should be noted that former Prime Minister Hariri, in the 2 months prior to the assassination, had been meeting with Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, on a weekly basis almost. Many meetings took place at night at the Hezbollah leader's home in the southern banlieue or suburbs of Beirut. And I don't think, and no one who in his right mind would think that Hezbollah was behind it. The International Tribunal was created by the Western power, imperial power, to take the accusation in the direction of Hezbollah and use this accusation or so-called verdict in order to contain and bring down Hezbollah. This has failed for the past 12 years or 15 years, and now it failed, and it will fail. And Nasrallah himself has mentioned time and again that he does not recognize this international tribunal because it is a politicized international tribunal. I myself, I am not a member of Hezbollah. They host me from time to time on their television, but I am an academic in the first place. I am objective. I think 99% Israel is behind the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri, and it is not and I base that not on circumstantial evidence. I base that on the AWACS airplane, command and control airplane, which came over Beirut on that day of February 14 and stayed over Beirut for about 3 hours, circling up north and south, right. And it only left Beirut at 2 p.m. While Mr. Hariri was assassinated around 1 p.m. And that was the first time the AWACS would come to circle Beirut, in addition to many other drones that were over Beirut and specifically over the area of the explosion. So all of the indication point in the direction of Israel. But of course, neither the United States nor the West would take these factors into consideration.
And I'm glad you made that point. Arthur, I'm going to give you the final word. We're just quickly running out of time. So I wanted to get your thoughts, Arthur, on Hezbollah now, right, in the present day situation. There is, of course, a lot of criticism of it, but nevertheless, as our other guests have mentioned, it is still a very powerful force. It still very much does have its supporters in Lebanon. Where do we go from here then when it comes to this organization?
Well, I think, Hezbollah is there. It should be dealt with accordingly. I mean, it's as you say, it's a party with a popular support, and they are welcome in the political spectrum, but not as an armed militia that's fighting proxy wars here and there in the region, and that in the end, Lebanon has to pay the price for it. And I would like to comment something what the previous speaker said. I mean, it is not really relevant if Rafik Hariri met Hassan Nasrallah or not. At that time, in Beirut, in 2004, 2005, it was impossible to drive around the city with 1,500 kilograms of TNT without the Syrian intelligence and Hezbollah operators knowing about it. Now, this organization works in separate cells. It's very likely that one cell doesn't know what the other cell is doing. So it's a very nice story, and saying it's all a Western institute to name and shame Hezbollah. I do not agree with that. In the past 15 years, I've met all the investigators. I've met Detlef Meles, the first German prosecutor who came to the scene. I met Brammertz, I met Belmare, and I met Saad Hariri, the son of Rafik Hariri, many times. And they all said, we all know Hezbollah did it, and it's now time for them. Now we have a verdict. Now it's time to come to the table and say, listen, we're going to sacrifice some. We have to change how we're dealing with things at the moment. We want to be part of Lebanon as a political party, and that's the only way forward.
Very well. We'll have to leave there as a final word, but we sincerely appreciate all three of our guests for their time and for the context that brought to this discussion. We're trying to give you, of course, all points of view on this issue. This is certainly an important one. But as all of the above have agreed, this tribunal in and of itself seems to have been a huge waste of time and a huge waste of money. I mean, $1 billion is not a joke, especially for a country that is going through such financial crisis and has really, if we're completely honest, has gone through financial crises a lot just over the past 15 years or so. $1 billion could have gone a long way in helping the country in many, many other realms. Was this all just a Western plot, as some of our guests have mentioned? Was or is Hezbollah guilty of the assassination of Rafik Hariri at the top leadership? The tribunal says no. It says that only one man is responsible for the assassination successfully going through against Hariri those 15 years ago. Obviously, this adds to the complications, doesn't it, on the ground right now, in the realities we're facing right now within Lebanon, since that port explosion and since these long-standing protests against the governance system as well. So there's a lot that we have to wait and see about both the Hezbollah reaction and the reactions on the ground, but it seems that they've been fairly muted and that people have been fairly unsatisfied, as Hadi and Naim had also outlined for us there from the Lebanese capital. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope. Now, in this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the UAE and Israel's normalization of ties and the continuing consequences and reactions to that. We have, of course, the UAE now saying, ever since Iran released a statement about the normalization of those ties, of course, condemning it. The UAE saying that the ties that is normalized with Israel have nothing to do with Iran and that it was its own sovereign decision. Now, this also, as Israel's Mossad chief has visited the UAE to discuss security issues with the United Arab Emirates. Cooperation in fields of security, quote unquote, is what the quote that came out officially of that meeting was. There have also been reports, as we all know, that Netanyahu has dismissed about possible sale of F-35s to the UAE because of this deal or as a secret part of this deal. Israel at this point denying that, but maybe that is part of this that we don't know. And then secondly, on top of all this, we have the Palestinians, right? The Palestinians have not been party to the normalization of these ties, or even really the peace deal at this point in time, the Middle East peace plan as put forth by Donald Trump earlier. Jared Kushner, the White House advisor and Donald Trump's son-in-law, has essentially bashed the Palestinian leadership, saying, quote unquote, that their credibility has fallen to an all-time low, and then Trump will not chase the Palestinians over the peace deal if they continue to reject the U.S. peace overtures. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by three esteemed guests. Abbey is joining us from Jerusalem. He's a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. He's writing a book currently on the history of media in Israel-Palestine. Joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. is Khalil Jahshan, who is the executive director of the Arab Center of Washington, D.C., which is an independent think tank that focuses on the Arab world and U.S. foreign policy. And finally, joining us from Heidelberg is Shir, who is a journalist and scholar who focuses on the Israeli occupation. Shir, Khalil, and Alan, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Shir, let me start with you. Let's start off with just the sovereign decision part, right? The UAE insisting this is a sovereign decision, but I find it hard to believe that Iran was not part of the calculus for the UAE to turn towards Israel. What do you make of that?
Well, the UAE is hardly qualified as a state in the modern sense of the word. It's a one-man show run by Mohammed bin Zayed, and this man can make decisions and then call them sovereign decisions, but it's not exactly sovereign in the sense of state decisions. In this case, we have actually a brilliant decision from his part. Because the UAE stands to gain quite a lot from an agreement with Israel. It will give the UAE a lot of legitimacy that it lacks in light of its military interventions in Yemen, in Libya, and in Syria. And by signing an agreement with Israel, it can hope to pretend to be more of a normal state. And indeed, already Netanyahu gave an interview to Sky News Arabia and said that both Israel and the UAE are progressive democracies. Of course, both of them are about as equally democratic. Both of them are very non-democratic countries, but in different ways. The UAE is a feudal monarchy, while Israel is an apartheid state.
Khalil, what do you make of the Iran factor in all this, right? Because even if Iran was not necessarily directly a part of the reasons why the UAE and Israel would normalize ties, the consequence for the Iranians is quite real, right? Because now you have potentially the Israelis that much closer to your borders. This is, in some ways, a security threat for Iran, isn't it?
Well, what the Iranian position certainly reflects the concerns of Tehran with regards to this new alliance, because frankly, this is not just an agreement or a normalization of relations, in the sense that these relations have been ongoing for many, many years. They have been normalized. Now an alliance is being constructed, as you could tell from the visits being paid by Israeli officials and business people to Abu Dhabi to cement and expand, if you will, that alliance. So Tehran wants to make sure, or is critical, I'm not sure it can stop it, but it's critical of what they perceive as an attempt by the United States on the one hand, who sponsored, if you will, or brokered this agreement, that these parties are not somehow conspiring to undermine further the security of Iran. So their statement could be a bit paranoid from certain perspectives, but it doesn't mean that it is totally detached from reality. The last thing it needs is alliances between its immediate neighbors, and not just any neighbor. This is, first of all, you're talking about the United Arab Emirates, which is Iran's first economic, if you will, partner in the Gulf region. The bulk of trade, the volume of trade between Tehran and Abu Dhabi is the largest in the Gulf. Number two, the importance of Dubai, particularly as an economic outlet to the world when Iran is facing all kinds of sanctions, is very crucial and very existential. So that is the reason for the concern on the part of the Iranian leadership about the significance of this alliance.
Alan, what's on that? Because this seems like this would appease the Israelis quite a bit, right? To have this, of course, normalization of ties in and of itself, but nevertheless, also to be that much closer now to Iran physically, potentially, of course, and to have an ally now to be that close to Iran and to make the Iranians this nervous.
Well, certainly Israel has tried for many years to normalize relations with all Arab countries, and until this deal, there had been only the two peace agreements with two former assailants of Israel in various wars, and this is the first time that anyone since then that has never actually been in active military conflict with Israel has signed a normalization agreement. It does, in fact, bring to light something that had been under the table and one of those open secrets. But there is a big difference between an open secret and an above-the-table agreement. And so it's a very big deal in Israel. I think Israelis, as usual, are getting ahead of themselves and already planning on trips not just to the UAE, but also to Bahrain and Oman and other regions and countries in that region. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. And of course, the big prize would be Saudi Arabia, but Saudi has said that they're not going to make any agreement with Israel until there is a deal with the Palestinians. So, in short, it's a very, very big deal for Israel. It's not as big as some optimists would think, and frankly, there are many in Israel who are not happy with it because it does put at least on the shelf, if not in the ice cooler, the annexation plans in the West Bank.
Okay, so Shir, let's talk about security, right? As we've had, of course, the Mossad chief visiting the UAE, and also then this talk of these F-35 planes and their possible sale or their alleged sale if there is a secret clause to this deal as well. Netanyahu's been quite insistent on the latter part, saying that no, that is not going to happen, that is not part of this deal, that that the Israelis will have that strategic advantage always in the region. What do you make of that?
Israel has been losing its strategic advantage in the region on many different levels, partially because the Israeli military is not as strong as it used to be, and the soldiers are not so much trained in actual warfare, but because they've mostly busied themselves in the last decades in suppressing Palestinian resistance to the occupation, so fighting against civilians, basically. The UAE, however, is a rising star in the Middle East when it comes to security and military interventions. And in the last 10 years, the UAE has actually surpassed Israel in imports from the United States. So for the United States, the UAE is a major export market, mainly for weapons. We also know that even before this agreement between Israel and the UAE, Israeli arms companies and security companies have provided the UAE with information, with offensive cyber capabilities. There's the very famous case of the arrest of human rights activist Ahmed Mansour using an Israeli company and Israeli technology in order to hack his phone, track his movements until the UAE authorities could arrest him. And that is exactly what the UAE wants to get from this. They want to get the position of being the U.S. representative in the Middle East, the military representative, and to take Israel's place and supplant Israel in that role. The F-35 deal is very important because the F-35 is currently the most important weapon in the world, or at least in terms of its symbolic importance as the weapon of choice of NATO. And it's very similar to the case of the Dolphin submarine classes that Germany sold to Israel. Yeah. What was not so much reported is the fact that as Germany sold those submarines to Israel, Netanyahu allowed Germany, or gave them the green light, to also sell the same kinds of submarines to Egypt. which, although it has a peace treaty with Israel, nevertheless, the Israeli military didn't even know that the Israeli government gave that permission to the German military companies to sell those submarines to Egypt. And it was done by a one-man decision by Netanyahu in a very non-democratic way, very authoritarian way. And now Netanyahu is saying that he did not give permission to the United States to sell F-35s to the UAE as part of this agreement, although many people involved in that agreement give a completely different report. Yeah. And it's very likely that Netanyahu is lying yet again, as he often does in these cases. And actually, in order to win some kind of short-term political gain for himself by taking credit for promoting this agreement with the UAE, he is allowing the strategic balance in the Middle East to change away from Israel and towards the UAE, something that actually serves the U.S. Arms industry very much, and therefore Trump is very much in favor of it.
Khalil, what are your thoughts on the security aspect of all this? And no doubt the UAE is an extremely rich nation, certainly. Do you think that the strategic advantage that the Israelis have enjoyed, military advantage, of course, will now wane?
I don't think so. Maybe in terms of if you continue, as some Israelis do, to look at these relationships from a zero-sum kind of perspective, any gain for the other side, regardless of who the other side is a loss for me, then maybe. Because Israel, look, over the past 70 years, Israel has had a certain type of relationship with the United States, where Washington allowed Israel to exert some kind of veto over security relations with other countries in the region. You know, the formula used to be that the U.S., through its arms sales and through its relationships in the Arab world, will not jeopardize or allow the relationship with Israel to weaken to the point where it would benefit so-called Israel's enemies on the Arab side. I mean, that's not the case here. I think it takes probably decades for the United Arab Emirates to really challenge Israeli security status in the region. What you have here is a Machiavellian trilateral relationship between three countries that are manipulating each other to try to maximize their benefits. A transactional president here in Washington trying to benefit economically. He never met an authoritarian leader that he wouldn't sell weapons to. He would be more than glad to sell F-35 and maybe F-50 to the Arabs before it's even invented. That's the nature of the beast. That's the nature of this presidency. And of course, the Arab world, particularly in the Gulf, would be more than happy to oblige and waste their monies on systems that they either do not need or are way beyond their capacity to even absorb or use. Meanwhile, Israel is benefiting from this. I think what you see about for and against F-35 is an attempt by Netanyahu to bargain. He is the master bargainer. And I'm sure he's trying to maximize what he can get out of a naive administration beyond the recognition they gave him on a silver platter by a significant Arab country. He's trying to maximize that probably in terms of other benefits to remain on top.
Alan, we're quickly running out of time. We just have about a minute left. I want to give you the final word, if I may. On this issue of security, what are your thoughts?
Well, I wouldn't reduce this deal only to security, but since that's because there is economic factors as well as both Israel and the UAE trying to balance themselves on a knife edge of opposition between countries such as China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and India, all of which are vying for leverage and power in that region while the U.S.'s power is waning. And so I think that some of the previous comments make sense, especially about Netanyahu trying to maximize what he can from a transactional president, and frankly, all of the leaders in this region looking beyond this November election, probably or seemingly hedging their bets against the likelihood of a different administration that won't treat them this way, and trying to close some deals before a different administration, a less erratic, a less easily manipulated, or less naive, shall we say, administration comes into power in the United States. And so all of these parties are working in multiple levels. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. We have frenemies in Israel, in this part of the world. Nobody is exactly a friend. And everybody at one point is both an enemy and working against each other. And everybody's trying to balance on this knife edge.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word, but we appreciate Alan, Khalil, and Shir for their time today and for their insight. Certainly this UAE-Israel deal, or normalization, I should call it, in fact, agreement continues to make waves, right, in the region and around the world. Again, an open secret, right, as Alan there had mentioned in one of his answers. No surprise to the rest of us, but this will have ramifications for the Palestinians. Now, that's something that we weren't able to discuss with our guests at this point. Nevertheless, the Iranian factor is important because that's something that the Emiratis and the Israelis can agree upon as a common enemy, quote unquote, an adversary for them in the region. They would view Tehran's power as something that is overarching and as a threat to their respective nations and national interests. And then we have the Mossad chief now visiting the UAE. We have Netanyahu talking about the F-35 secret, quote-unquote, clause that has been spoken about in media. Is there a secret clause? Will the UAE acquire F-35 planes as a side benefit, possibly, to this normalization of ties with the Israelis? We'll have to, of course, wait and see on all of the above. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.